Well, joining us live now is the Liberal Senator Holly Hughes and Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite. Good morning, guys. First to you, Matt. The review from the Solicitor General has been described as scathing. Have you seen it yet?
No, I haven't. I understand it's been handed to the Prime Minister and it'll go to a Cabinet meeting this morning, and the Prime Minister has determined that it will be released to the public, and that's quite rare. And we'll wait and see what the Solicitor General advises. But this is a pretty sad and sorry saga where the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison attempted to hide from the Australian people the ministries that he took over. There was confusion about who was in charge of what, but we need to clear that up and make sure that it doesn't happen again. By
pursuing the former Prime Minister so vigorously, are you in danger of forgetting about the Australian battlers at the moment?
Well, I don't think we're in danger of forgetting about the battlers at all. That's what the Jobs and Skills Summit is about next week. It's about ensuring that we put in place measures cooperatively with business and unions to grow the economy and create jobs. That's the major focus. But this came up. This was disclosed in a book that was written about the former government and the Prime Minister, and it's highly unusual. It's been a mini constitutional crisis in terms of the role of the Governor-General, the role of the Prime Minister and who was responsible for what. We didn't put this on the agenda. This was put on the agenda by the previous government.
OK, yeah, I do want to ask you about the Governor-General in a second, but first to you, Holly, you've got those comments there from Matt and then Matt's colleague Richard Marles, who said on the program earlier that there should be severe consequences for Scott Morrison and a strong reaction from the opposition leader Peter Dutton. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the language around this just is heightening day by day. It's almost becoming farcical. What does Richard Marles want? I mean, Scott lost the Prime Ministership. He's not in a shadow portfolio. He was elected by the people of Cook. He's the member for Cook. I'm not sure. What is Richard Marles talking about? It's just ridiculous. And to Matt's point that this was confusion, I mean, the exact point that they're making is actually that no one knew that these appointments had been made. There was no confusion about who was in charge because what's ultimately occurred, which is actually, I think, the problem, was that it was done in secret. So there was no mini constitutional crisis. There was no issue with no one knew who was in charge because no one actually knew these things were going on. So we're getting more hysterical in the language from the ALP, and I think that's because they don't have a solution for the battlers, as you talk about. They have no plan to look at inflation. They have no clue how to deal with the cost of living pressures. They're running away from their claim that there'd be a $275 power energy bill cut under them. They won't even say the figure now, and the figure they said so many times during the campaign. This is a little bit of a shiny thing that they're trying to use to distract the Australian people. And when Richard Marles or others calls for some sort of political punishment, I think they need to be much more clear with what they're saying, because at the moment it just seems like hysterical rhetoric.
Matt, you are Assistant Minister for the Republic. How should the role of the Governor-General be addressed in any kind of broad review?
Well, I don't believe that the Governor-General's done anything wrong, Pete. He acted on the advice of the Prime Minister, which is the nature of the role. But I have said that I do believe that if we had an Australian head of state, that this may not have occurred. And I base that on this, that the current Governor-General is appointed by the Queen and swears allegiance to act on behalf of the Queen. If we had an Australian head of state that was appointed by the Australian people, either by the Parliament or by an election of the Australian people, they would be obliged to act in the interests of the Australian people, not the Queen. And I can't see how they wouldn't insist that a Prime Minister disclose this to the Australian people when it occurred. And I think it just highlights the fact that we need to begin a discussion, a serious discussion about having one of our own as our head of state again.
Well, I mean, I might just point out there Peter Fitzsimons' answer to having or being a republic. I mean, wouldn't any kind of president just do what the Prime Minister said anyway? So it'd essentially be the same.
But if they've got an obligation to act in the interests of the Australian people and uphold the Constitution on behalf of the Australian people, I believe that they would have to insist that the Prime Minister disclose this to the Australian people. I think the thing coming out of this is that hopefully in the future we'll put in place measures to ensure that this never happens again, be that a tabling in the Parliament, some form of publication in a Gazette or a media release. But if the if the head of state had the obligation to act on behalf of the Australian people, they would have to insist that a Prime Minister disclose this in the future to the Australian people, who are ultimately the crux of our democracy and need to be informed about decisions like this.
Holly, is the GG in the clear here?
Seriously, no wonder the Republican movement in Australia just continues to fail. That is the biggest load of rubbish I have ever just heard being spouted. I mean, the fact that you're saying the Governor-General doesn't act in the interests of the Australian people, that the government, the parliament, the Prime Minister doesn't act in the interests of the Australian people, that somehow or other the Constitution could be altered in a way that codified the release, a media release being deemed essential. There is nothing that is going to be put in the Constitution that determines a media release be sent out. And at the moment, the Governor-General is the representative of the Queen, but is officially, is basically appointed by the Prime Minister, is certainly nominated by the Prime Minister. And depending on what model the Republicans are trying to push forward at the moment, if it's something that, if it's someone who's elected by the Parliament, it would fundamentally be someone nominated by the Prime Minister anyway. I mean, this is just ludicrous, the way they are chasing their tails around on this and trying to turn it into some push for the Republican movement.
Just a final one
Holly,
here. Go, Matt.
The former Prime Minister didn't act in the interests of the Australian people. That's the point. We don't
know that. We're waiting for advice.
And there's now confusion about whether or not decisions that were made by that Prime Minister are legal and verifiable or not. That's the confusion that was created by
there's no confusion. There's advice that's been given. We'll see it this afternoon. And Matt, I think what you might find is there's nothing illegal, because your senior cabinet members have been walking away from that language over the past few days, and we'll see what the advice is this afternoon, and we'll go from hysterics over it could have been illegal and no one knew what was going on to, oh, there was nothing illegal but this just didn't look right, which, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with, but, the language I think needs to be tempered and put some sense into this rather than creating hysteria. There was no confusion about decisions because no one knew.
Okay, Matt and Holly, now we're out of time, but appreciate your time as always. Thank you. We'll talk to you again soon. Well, Russia is